It was a sunny afternoon in Willow Creek, the kind of day where the breeze carried the scent of freshly baked pies from the local diner, and kids rode their bikes up and down Main Street. Life in this little town was simple, predictable, and, for most people, uneventful. For Emily Grayson, that was exactly how she liked it. Emily adjusted her scrubs as she stepped out of the hospital, her shoulders aching from a long day. The small-town hospital wasn't glamorous, but she loved her work. She loved knowing her hands helped heal wounds, her calm voice reassured frightened patients, and her smile brought comfort to those who needed it most. To the townsfolk, she was just the nurse, the quiet, kind woman who always seemed to be there when they needed her. The older folks in town called her an angel in scrubs, though they never truly looked past the surface. She didn't mind. In fact, she preferred it that way. To them, Emily was just a young woman who had moved to Willow Creek 5 years ago, fresh out of nursing school, eager to escape the noise of the big city. Nobody asked too many questions, and Emily never offered much about herself. Her co-workers sometimes tried to pry into her personal life. "So, where's your family, Emily, or don't you get lonely, living all by yourself?" She always answered politely but vaguely, shifting the topic back to work. The truth wasn't something she wanted to share, not here, not with anyone. What no one in Willow Creek knew was that Emily Grayson had a past far more complicated than her gentle demeanor suggested. Her quiet nature wasn't just a personality trait, it was a choice, a carefully built shield she had constructed to protect the life she had made for herself here. Emily had grown up in a world far removed from the calm streets of Willow Creek. Her father, Sam Grayson, was no ordinary man. He wasn't the kind of dad who worked a 9-to-5 job, coached Little League, or fixed cars in the driveway. Sam was a retired CIA operative, a man who had spent decades navigating dangerous missions, handling classified operations, and outsmarting some of the world's most dangerous people. From a young age, Emily had been exposed to a life that most people could only imagine from spy movies or thriller novels. While other kids her age were learning to ride bikes, Emily was learning how to memorize escape routes. Her father's lessons weren't about multiplication tables or bedtime stories, they were about observation, discipline, and survival. "Always pay attention to the little details," Sam would say, his voice calm but firm. "The world is full of clues, Emily. Most people walk through life blind to them. But not you. Not us." Sam taught her how to blend in, how to defend herself, and how to think 3 steps ahead in any situation. "You don't have to be the strongest person in the room," he'd say, "just the smartest." Emily didn't resent her father for the life he had given her, in fact, she admired him deeply. But as she grew older, she realized she didn't want to live in the shadows forever. She didn't want a life of constant vigilance, always looking over her shoulder, always wondering who could be trusted. After her mother passed away when Emily was in her teens, she and her father grew even closer. But by the time she graduated college, she was ready for something different. She wanted a life where she could help people in ways that didn't involve danger or deception. She wanted peace. So, she chose Willow Creek, a small town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing much ever happened. Or so she thought. As Emily walked to her car that afternoon, the late summer sun warming her face, she let out a deep sigh. Another day, another set of lives tended to. She reached into her pocket for her keys, the weight of her shift still lingering in her body. Her routine was simple: work, grab a coffee from Pete's Diner, and head home to her cozy little house on the edge of town. But just as she opened her car door, she heard the distinct, low rumble of motorcycles in the distance. The sound grew louder, echoing down the quiet street, until a group of bikes rolled into view. Emily glanced up briefly, her nurse's instincts making her take in the scene. 5 men on shiny, rumbling machines parked across from the hospital. They were loud, laughing, and dressed in leather jackets adorned with patches Emily couldn't quite make out from where she stood. She had seen bikers pass through town before. Willow Creek wasn't far from a major highway, so it wasn't unusual for travelers to stop for food or gas. But something about this group felt different. They weren't just passing through, they seemed to linger, their presence heavy, almost intentional. Emily didn't stare. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, "Don't make yourself a target. Stay unnoticed." She slid into her car and drove off, keeping her expression neutral. The bikers didn't follow her, and she quickly pushed the encounter to the back of her mind. After all, bikers weren't uncommon, and they hadn't done anything to her. As she pulled into the parking lot of Pete's Diner, Emily shook off the strange feeling that lingered. The familiar smell of coffee and fresh pie greeted her as she walked inside. The small-town chatter of locals filled the room, and she nodded politely to a few familiar faces before sliding into her usual booth. Nancy, the diner's friendly waitress, approached with a grin. "Rough shift, hon. You look like you could use a slice of pie." Emily smiled faintly. "You know me too well, Nancy. Coffee and a slice of apple pie, please." As she waited for her order, Emily pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages from the hospital about upcoming schedules. The world outside the diner felt far away. She didn't notice the rumble of motorcycles pulling into the parking lot until it was too late. The same group of bikers she had seen earlier walked into Pete's Diner, their presence instantly shifting the atmosphere. Conversations quieted, and even Nancy paused mid-step as the men took over a booth near the back. Emily didn't look up, keeping her focus on her phone. She knew better than to draw attention to herself. "Hey, sweetheart," one of the bikers called out, his voice loud and dripping with mockery. "You look like you could use some company." Laughter erupted from the group, and Emily's jaw tightened. She didn't respond, keeping her gaze fixed downward. Nancy returned with her coffee and pie, giving her a sympathetic look. "Just ignore them," she whispered. Emily nodded, her calm exterior betraying none of the irritation she felt. She wasn't the type to escalate situations, but she also wasn't the type to let them rattle her. Still, something about these men felt off. And deep down, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this quiet, predictable life she had built in Willow Creek might not stay quiet for much longer. The diner grew quieter as the bikers' loud voices filled the room. Their presence was like a storm cloud drifting into an otherwise peaceful sky, casting a shadow over the friendly chatter that usually made Pete's Diner feel like home. Emily focused on her coffee, her calm demeanor masking the unease creeping into her thoughts. "Hey, I'm talking to you." The same biker called out, his tone sharper now, as if irritated that she hadn't acknowledged him. His friends chuckled, egging him on. Emily didn't flinch. Years of training with her father had taught her how to keep her composure in tense situations. Rule 1, don't give them the reaction they're looking for. Nancy, the ever-protective waitress, stepped in. She placed her hands on her hips and gave the men a hard stare. "All right, that's enough. You want to eat here, you act like gentlemen. Otherwise, there's the door." The bikers laughed, but one of them muttered, Yeah, keep your apron on, lady." Still, they turned their attention back to their table, seemingly content to entertain themselves for the moment. Nancy gave Emily a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Don't mind them, hon. They're just blowing hot air. Nothing but a bunch of overgrown kids." Emily nodded, giving her a small smile. But deep down, she wasn't convinced. These weren't just overgrown kids. She'd seen men like them before, men who thrived on intimidation, who enjoyed making others uncomfortable just to prove they could. Her father had taught her to spot the subtle signs of trouble, the way they took over the room, the way their leaders' eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, calculating and cold. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her mind racing. She didn't want to overreact. After all, they hadn't done anything yet. Maybe Nancy was right. Maybe they'd just eat their food, crack a few more jokes, and leave. But her instincts told her to stay alert. As the minutes passed, Emily couldn't help but notice how the bikers seemed to linger. They weren't eating, and their conversation had dropped to hushed tones. Every so often, she caught one of them glancing in her direction. She didn't react, keeping her eyes on the plate in front of her, but her body remained tense. Finally, she decided it was time to leave. Sliding a few bills onto the table, Emily stood up, grabbed her bag, and headed for the door. She could feel their eyes on her as she walked past their table, but she kept her gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge them. Leaving so soon, one of the men called out, his voice carrying a mocking edge. Emily didn't respond. She pushed the door open and stepped into the cool evening air, the smell of rain on the horizon. As she walked to her car, she noticed how empty the parking lot seemed. The street lights cast long shadows, and the sound of her footsteps echoed against the asphalt. She reached her car and unlocked the door, glancing over her shoulder as she slid into the driver's seat. The bikers were still inside, but something about the way they had acted didn't sit right with her. She locked the doors and started the engine, taking a moment to steady her breathing. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, calm and steady as always. "Trust your instincts, Emily. They're usually right." The next few days passed uneventfully, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The bikers seemed to have made themselves at home in Willow Creek. Their motorcycles were parked outside the gas station, the hardware store, even the hospital at odd hours. They weren't overtly causing trouble, but their presence was impossible to ignore. People in town started whispering about them, their usual cheerful gossip taking on a nervous edge. "They're probably just passing through," someone said at the hospital. "Maybe," another replied. "But I don't like the way they're hanging around. Feels off." Emily kept her thoughts to herself. She wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the unease in her chest hadn't gone away. Every time she saw them, she couldn't help but notice the way they watched people, their calculating stares, their smug grins. One evening, after another long shift, Emily found herself at Pete's diner again. She had debated going straight home, but something about the quiet hum of the diner always calmed her nerves. This time, the bikers weren't there. The usual crowd filled the booths, and Nancy greeted her with a warm smile. "Back again?" Nancy teased as she poured Emily a cup of coffee. "You're gonna turn into one of us regulars if you keep this up." Emily chuckled softly. "Maybe I already am." The two shared a laugh, and for a moment, Emily let herself relax. But just as she was finishing her meal, the rumble of motorcycles shattered the peaceful atmosphere. The door swung open, and the bikers strolled in, their presence as disruptive as ever. Emily tensed, her fork pausing mid-air. She didn't look up, but she could feel the shift in the room. The chatter quieted, and even Nancy's cheerful demeanor dimmed. This time, the bikers didn't sit at their usual table. They walked straight to the counter, their leader a tall man with a scar running down his cheek leaning casually against it. "Coffee," he said, his voice low and commanding. Nancy hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Coming right up." As Nancy moved to pour their coffee, the man's eyes scanned the diner, landing on Emily. He smirked, a look that sent a chill down her spine. "You again," he said, his tone almost amused. "You must really like this place." Emily didn't respond. She kept her focus on her plate, hoping he'd lose interest. But he didn't. He sauntered over to her table, his boots thudding against the floor. "You don't talk much, do you?" he said, his smirk widening. Emily set her fork down, her calm expression betraying none of the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "Just trying to eat in peace," she said simply. The man chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "Fair enough. We'll let you get back to it." He turned and walked back to the counter, but not before giving her one last lingering look. As soon as they left, Nancy hurried over to Emily's table. "You okay, hon?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Emily nodded. "I'm fine." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Something told her that this was just the beginning. Over the next few days, the biker's behavior escalated. It started with small things, a crude comment here, a lingering stare there. But then they slashed her car's tires outside the hospital, leaving her stranded after a late shift. Emily stood in the empty parking lot, staring at the deflated tires. The bikers were nowhere to be seen, but she knew it was them. For a moment, she considered calling the police. But she knew from experience that people like them didn't scare easily. Instead, she pulled out her phone and made a call. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I might need a little help with something." On the other end of the line, Sam Grayson's voice was as steady as she remembered. "What's going on, Em?" Emily hesitated for a moment before replying. "Just some trouble. Nothing I can't handle. But I might need backup." There was a pause before Sam responded. "I'll be there." Emily hung up, her mind already racing. She had spent years trying to leave her old life behind, but it seemed the past had a way of catching up. And this time, she wasn't going to let anyone push her around. Emily pushed open the door to Pete's Diner, her sanctuary after exhausting shifts at the hospital. The familiar smell of coffee and fried food usually comforted her, but tonight felt different. The noise from the group of bikers outside followed her inside, their rowdy laughter and crude remarks seeping into the normally peaceful atmosphere. She kept her eyes on the counter, pretending not to notice the way their attention zeroed in on her as she passed. A chorus of mocking whistles followed her steps, but Emily didn't falter. Years of practice helped her maintain an outward calm even when her nerves were on edge. Sliding into her usual booth by the window, she placed her bag beside her and opened a menu, not because she needed to check it, she knew it by heart, but to avoid looking up. Nancy, the friendly waitress who worked the late shift, came over with a sympathetic smile. "Rough night?" Nancy asked, pouring Emily a cup of coffee. "You could say that," Emily replied, her voice low but steady. Nancy glanced toward the group outside, her brow furrowing. "They've been here all week. Loud, obnoxious, and they don't tip. Honestly, I'm about ready to call the sheriff." Emily nodded absently, gripping her coffee cup. She didn't need to look to know the bikers were still watching her. The feeling of being under their scrutiny was almost tangible, a weight pressing against her shoulders. Moments later, the door swung open with a loud creak, and the bikers strutted in, bringing the chill of the evening air with them. Their leader, a burly man with a beard streaked with gray, glanced around the room before his gaze landed on Emily. He smirked, and the rest of the group followed his lead, their footsteps heavy as they moved to claim a table in the center of the diner. "Hey, sweetheart," the leader called out, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "How about you come over here and keep us company?" Emily didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him. She knew better than to feed their ego with a reaction. "Ah, don't be shy," another biker chimed in, leaning back in his chair. "We're real friendly, promise." Their laughter filled the room, grating against her nerves. The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances but remained silent, avoiding the confrontation. Emily's grip on her coffee cup tightened. Nancy shot them a warning look as she approached their table. "You want coffee or not?" The leader chuckled, leaning forward. "Relax, lady. We're just having a little fun. No harm in that, right?" Nancy wasn't amused. "This is a diner, not a bar. You want to eat, fine. But keep it down or take it outside." The tension in the room was palpable, but the bikers seemed to thrive on it. Their leader waved Nancy off with a dismissive hand. Yeah, yeah, bring us some coffee. Emily kept her gaze fixed on the table in front of her, her mind racing. These weren't just harmless jokers. Their confidence, their arrogance, it was the kind of behavior she'd seen before, in men who thought they were untouchable. Men like this didn't stop until someone made them. She debated leaving, but the thought of walking past them again made her hesitate. Instead, she stayed put, finishing her coffee in deliberate silence. The next day, Emily noticed the bikers were everywhere. Their motorcycles lined up outside the gas station, the convenience store, and even the park where families usually spent their afternoons. They weren't overtly causing trouble, but their presence was impossible to ignore. The townspeople, usually warm and cheerful, now moved with a subtle tension, avoiding eye contact and hurrying past whenever the bikers were near. At the hospital, Emily overheard two of her colleagues talking in hushed voices. "Have you seen those guys? They've been hanging around all week." "Yeah, I heard they're staying at that old motel on the edge of town. Someone said they've been hassling people, but no one wants to call the cops." Emily pretended not to listen, but her ears perked up at the mention of the motel. She had passed by it on her way to work that morning and had noticed the row of motorcycles parked out front. That evening, as she left the hospital, Emily felt a prickle of unease. The parking lot was mostly empty, the street lights casting long shadows across the asphalt. As she approached her car, she froze. Her tires had been slashed, the rubber shredded beyond repair. Her heart sank, but she refused to let fear take over. Pulling out her phone, she dialed the only person she could think of. "Dad," she said when he answered. "We might have a situation." The following day, Emily took the bus to work. The damage to her car was a nuisance, but it wasn't enough to shake her. If the bikers thought they could intimidate her, they were wrong. During her lunch break, she received a text from her father, "Keep your head down. I'm on my way." Emily smiled faintly. Her dad always knew when to step in, even when she didn't ask for help outright. But she wasn't about to wait passively. If there was one thing Sam Grayson had taught her, it was to be prepared. That evening, Emily walked into Pete's diner again. The bikers were there, just as she'd expected, their loud voices dominating the space. This time, she didn't avoid their gaze. As she passed their table, she met the leader's eyes with a steady, unflinching stare. He smirked. "Well, look who's got some fire in her. You finally gonna talk to us, sweetheart?" Emily stopped, her voice calm but firm. "You slashed my tires." The smirk faded, replaced by a look of feigned innocence. "Now why would we do something like that?" "I'm not here to argue," Emily said, her tone cold. "I just wanted to let you know it's not going to work." The leader chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Not going to work, huh? What are you gonna do about it?" Emily didn't answer. She turned and walked to her booth, leaving the bikers to their laughter. But in her mind, she was already calculating her next move. The bikers didn't stop. Over the next few days, they escalated their harassment, blocking her path in the parking lot, making lewd comments when she walked by, even following her car once she'd gotten it repaired. Emily documented everything, keeping a meticulous record of their actions. One evening, she found a note taped to her door. The handwriting was sloppy, the words crude and threatening. She sat on her couch, staring at the note, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her anymore. These men were a danger to the town, to the people she cared about. The next morning, she met her father at the diner. Sam Grayson looked the same as always, calm, collected, and unshakable. He listened intently as Emily recounted everything that had happened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at his lips. "You've done well so far," he said. "But it's time to send a message." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't afraid anymore. It was time to remind these men that they had underestimated the wrong person. Emily leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. They think they own this town. They think no one will stand up to them. Sam Grayson gave her a knowing look, his lips curling into a slight smirk. That's because they haven't met the right kind of resistance yet. These types thrive on fear and intimidation. Take that away, and they crumble. Good, Emily said, her eyes narrowing. I'm tired of staying quiet. They crossed the line. Sam reached into his jacket and slid a small notebook across the table. It was worn, the leather cover scratched and faded, but the pages inside were meticulously organized. What's this? Emily asked, picking it up. A record of everything they've done, Sam replied. Their leader goes by Tank. Real name's Robert Tannen. He's been in and out of jail for years: assault, theft, extortion. The rest of his crew aren't much better. They move from town to town, cause chaos, and leave before the authorities can catch up. Emily flipped through the notebook, her stomach tightening with each page. The bikers weren't just a nuisance, they were predators. And now they had chosen Willow Creek as their latest hunting ground. Sam leaned back, his expression serious. I've been keeping tabs on guys like this since I retired. Thought I was done dealing with them, but I'm not about to let them mess with my daughter or this town. Emily's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and determination. Her father had always been her anchor, the one person she could count on no matter what. But this time, she wasn't just going to rely on him. She was ready to fight back. That evening, Emily and Sam set their plan in motion. It started small, subtle disruptions that the bikers wouldn't trace back to them. Emily used her hospital connections to gather information. It wasn't hard to find out where the bikers were staying. The old motel on the edge of town had become their base of operations. The motel manager, a nervous man named Frank, was more than willing to talk once Emily assured him that help was on the way. They've been trashing the place, Frank said, his voice trembling. I tried to kick them out, but they just laughed in my face. I can't afford to lose more business, so I let it slide. Not anymore, Emily said firmly. You're not alone in this. Meanwhile, Sam worked in the shadows. He visited local businesses, subtly rallying the community. The townsfolk were tired of living in fear, and Sam's calm authority gave them the confidence they needed to stand up. At the same time, he began sowing seeds of paranoia among the bikers. A slashed motorcycle tire here, a missing wallet there, small inconveniences that made them start to question their own security. Tank, the leader, was the first to notice. He stormed into Pete's diner one night, his face red with anger. Who's been messing with us? He demanded, slamming his fist on the counter. Nancy, the waitress, didn't even flinch. She'd been briefed by Sam and Emily, and her newfound courage showed. Maybe you should look in the mirror, she said coolly. Tank glared at her, but before he could respond, Emily entered the diner. She walked straight to her usual booth, her expression unreadable. Hey, sweetheart, Tank sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. You know anything about this? Emily didn't answer right away. She took her time, pouring a cup of coffee and stirring in a packet of sugar. When she finally looked up, her gaze was steady. I know you don't belong here, she said, her tone calm but cutting. And I know your time is running out. For a moment, the room went silent. Tank's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Emily didn't wait for his response. She stood and walked out, leaving him to stew in his confusion. The next phase of their plan was more direct. Sam had connections in law enforcement, and while the local sheriff was hesitant to confront the bikers, he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence Sam and Emily provided. Reports of harassment, vandalism, and threats were piling up, each one carefully documented. At the same time, Emily began to show the town who she really was. She started with small acts of courage, standing up to the bikers when they harassed others, stepping in to protect the more vulnerable members of the community. Her quiet strength inspired others to do the same. One night, as she walked home from the hospital, Emily noticed one of the bikers trailing her. She didn't panic. Instead, she led him into an alley where Sam was waiting in the shadows. The biker didn't stand a chance. Within seconds, Sam had him pinned against the wall, his voice low and menacing. "You tell your boss this ends now. If you don't, it's going to get a lot worse for you." The biker nodded frantically, his bravado crumbling. Sam let him go, and he ran off into the night. "That'll send a message," Sam said, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. Emily nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. The bikers, frustrated by their dwindling control, decided to take matters into their own hands. They stormed into the diner one evening, their presence a blatant challenge. Emily was ready. She stood behind the counter, her stance calm but firm. Sam was nearby, his watchful eyes scanning the room. The townsfolk, emboldened by Emily's courage, refused to back down. "You think you can scare us?" Tank snarled, his voice echoing through the diner. "No," Emily replied, stepping forward. "But I think it's time you learned what fear really feels like." Before Tank could respond, the door burst open. A team of law enforcement officers, led by one of Sam's old colleagues, entered the diner. "Robert Tannen," the officer said, his tone authoritative. "You're under arrest." The bikers were caught off guard, their arrogance crumbling as they realized they had been outmaneuvered. As the officers cuffed Tank and his crew, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. The town was safe again, and the bikers' reign of terror was over. In the days that followed, life in Willow Creek returned to normal. The townsfolk, once hesitant to stand up for themselves, now walked with a newfound confidence. Emily, too, felt a change within herself. For years, she had kept her true self hidden, but now she embraced the strength and resilience her father had instilled in her. Sam stayed for a while longer, helping Emily repair her car and reconnect with the community. But eventually, he packed his bags and prepared to leave. "You don't need me anymore," he said with a smile. "You've got this." Emily hugged him tightly. "I learned from the best." As he drove away, Emily stood on the porch, watching until his car disappeared from view. Sometimes, the quietest people hold the greatest power. And in a town like Willow Creek, Emily Grayson had proven that strength comes in many forms. Over the next few days, the tension in Willow Creek grew thicker. The bikers were making their presence felt everywhere at Pete's Diner, outside the grocery store, even loitering near the hospital parking lot where Emily worked. Their jeers and laughter echoed through the quiet streets, their sense of entitlement growing bolder by the hour. Emily tried to focus on her work, but the whispers among her co-workers were impossible to ignore. "Did you hear what they did to old Mr. Carter? Rode right through his field and destroyed half his crops," one nurse murmured. "They were at the gas station last night, wouldn't let anyone fill up unless they paid double," said another. "They've been hanging around here a lot too," the receptionist added, glancing nervously out the window. "Why do they keep targeting Emily?" Emily knew exactly why. The bikers had decided she was an easy target, the quiet nurse who wouldn't fight back. But they were wrong. One evening after a particularly long shift, Emily walked out to the hospital parking lot to find her car sitting at a slight angle. Her stomach tightened as she approached. Sure enough, two of her tires had been slashed clean through. A sharp whistle cut through the air. She turned to see one of the bikers leaning against a lamppost, a smug grin on his face. "Having some car trouble, sweetheart?" he called out. Emily didn't answer. Instead, she knelt beside the damaged tires, inspecting the cuts. They were clean, too clean for someone who didn't know their way around a blade. She made a mental note of the detail and stood up, brushing her hands on her scrubs. "Need a ride?" he asked, stepping closer. Emily met his gaze, her face calm but her eyes sharp. "I'll manage," she said coolly. The biker hesitated, as if thrown off by her lack of fear. He smirked anyway and swaggered off, shouting over his shoulder, "Next time, we might not stop at the tires." That night, Emily sat at her kitchen table, her phone in her hand. She had tried to leave this kind of life behind, but the bikers weren't giving her a choice. She dialed a familiar number, and after a few rings, her father's gruff voice came through. "Emily. What's going on?" "Hey, Dad," she began, her tone steady. "I might need a little help with something." Sam Grayson listened quietly as Emily explained the situation. When she finished, there was a long pause. "They don't sound like the kind of people who back down easily," he finally said. "They aren't," Emily agreed. "But they're sloppy. Arrogant. They think they're untouchable." A low chuckle rumbled through the phone. "Well, arrogance can be a weakness. I'll be there tomorrow." True to his word, Sam arrived the next afternoon, pulling into Emily's driveway in his dusty old pickup truck. He stepped out, wearing a simple jacket and jeans, but there was no mistaking the sharpness in his eyes. "You look good, Dad," Emily said, smiling as she greeted him. "You look tired," he replied, his tone laced with concern. They sat down in her living room, and Emily laid out everything she had observed. The bikers moved in groups, always led by their leader, a man they called Tank. He was large, loud, and undeniably the one in charge. The rest followed his lead without question, each one trying to outdo the other in displays of bravado. "They're predictable," Sam said, nodding as Emily finished. "That's good. Predictable people are easier to deal with." "What do we do first?" she asked. Sam leaned back, a thoughtful look on his face. "We watch. We learn their weaknesses. And when the time comes, we remind them they picked the wrong town and the wrong person to mess with." Over the next few days, Emily and Sam began their quiet surveillance. Sam had brought along a pair of binoculars and a small notebook, tools he had once used during his years in the CIA. Together, they spent hours observing the bikers from a distance, noting their habits and vulnerabilities. Emily discovered that Tank wasn't as invincible as he wanted everyone to believe. He had a temper, one that flared whenever something didn't go his way. One night at the diner, she watched him lose control when his food order took too long, flipping a table and storming out while his crew scrambled to clean up the mess. "That's his weakness," Sam said later. "He needs to feel like he's in control. Take that away, and he'll unravel." Emily also noticed the bikers weren't as united as they appeared. There were subtle cracks in their loyalty, snide comments when Tank wasn't looking, eye rolls during his long-winded rants. "They follow him because they're afraid of him," she observed. Sam nodded. "Fear only lasts as long as there's no alternative. Show them a better option, and they'll turn on him in a heartbeat." One evening, Emily decided to test her theory. She was leaving the diner when one of the younger bikers, a wiry man named Jake, approached her. "Hey," he said, his tone hesitant. "Look, I didn't have anything to do with your car, okay?" That was all, Tank. Emily raised an eyebrow. "And you just went along with it?" Jake looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot. "What was I supposed to do? Say no to him? You don't know what he's like." "I know exactly what he's like," Emily said. "And I know he doesn't care about you or anyone else in that crew. You're just there to make him look powerful." Jake didn't respond, but the flicker of doubt in his eyes told her she had struck a nerve. The next day, Sam took matters into his own hands. He waited until the bikers had parked their motorcycles outside the motel and slipped into the shadows. With practiced precision, he loosened the bolts on one of the bikes, knowing it would cause no harm but send a clear message. When Tank discovered the sabotaged bike, his fury was explosive. He shouted at his crew, accusing them of carelessness and incompetence. Emily watched from a distance, her lips curving into a small smile. "They're starting to turn on each other." "Good," Sam said. "The more divided they are, the easier they'll be to handle." The real turning point came a few nights later. Emily was walking home from the hospital when she heard the low growl of an engine behind her. She glanced back to see Tank's bike approaching, his massive frame silhouetted against the streetlights. "Out late again, nurse," he called, pulling up beside her. Emily stopped and turned to face him. "What do you want?" Tank smirked, his teeth glinting in the dim light. "Just making sure you're safe. Can't have anything happening to our favorite nurse." Her heart pounded, but she refused to show fear. "I don't need your protection," she said evenly. Tank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're bold, I'll give you that. But bold doesn't mean smart." As he revved his engine and sped off, Emily's resolve hardened. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for the entire town. When she got home, Sam was waiting for her on the porch. "He followed me tonight," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Sam's jaw tightened. "Then it's time we make our next move." Sam wasted no time. After Emily explained what had happened, they moved to the small shed behind her house. The tools and gardening supplies were pushed aside to reveal a locked trunk. Emily knelt down, unlocking it to reveal its contents, items from her father's past life. Inside were pieces of equipment Sam had kept from his days in the CIA. A compact surveillance kit, a few small tools for discreet sabotage, and a carefully organized collection of self-defense gear. Emily glanced at her father, her expression one of quiet determination. "We can't keep waiting for them to push further." Sam nodded. "Agreed. But we still need to play it smart. Acting too soon could escalate things." He pulled out a small recorder and handed it to Emily. "Start carrying this. If they confront you again, we'll have proof. And don't be afraid to push back sometimes, showing strength is enough to make people back off." Emily began to push the limits of her interactions with the bikers, subtly testing the cracks she had seen in their loyalty. She walked with more confidence when she crossed paths with them, refusing to acknowledge their jeers. At Pete's diner, one of the crew, a man named Vince, tried to grab her arm as she passed his table. Emily turned sharply, her voice calm but firm. "Don't touch me." The rest of the bikers burst into laughter, but Vince froze, caught off guard by the sharpness in her tone. Tank watched from his seat, his eyes narrowing. "You're awfully brave for someone all alone," Tank said, his voice low and menacing. Emily met his gaze without flinching. "And you're awfully loud for someone who's losing control." The diner went silent. Tank's face darkened, but before he could respond, Emily walked away. Later that evening, Sam parked his truck near the motel where the bikers were staying. He and Emily had spent the day going over every piece of information they had gathered: Tank's temper, the crew's dependence on him, and the cracks in their loyalty. Sam handed Emily a set of earphones. "Listen to this." He had been recording the bikers' conversations for the past 2 days using a directional microphone. On one of the recordings, 2 of the crew members were talking in hushed voices, complaining about Tank's behavior. "I'm sick of him bossing us around," one of them said. "This isn't what I signed up for." "Yeah, well, what are you gonna do about it?" the other replied. Sam smirked. "Discontent is a powerful tool. We're going to let them tear themselves apart from the inside." The next day, Emily walked into the hospital to find another unwelcome surprise. The bikers had vandalized the parking lot, spraying crude graffiti across the pavement. But instead of reacting with fear or anger, she calmly walked inside and called the maintenance crew. Her co-workers watched in awe as she carried on with her day as though nothing had happened. "How are you not furious about this?" one of them asked. Emily shrugged. "They're trying to scare me. If I let them, they win." That afternoon, Sam struck again. He waited until the bikers were out, then slipped into the motel parking lot and loosened the spark plugs on 3 of their bikes. When the crew returned and discovered the issue, Tank exploded in anger, accusing his men of carelessness. "You're all useless," he shouted, throwing a wrench across the lot. One of the younger bikers, clearly fed up, muttered under his breath, "Maybe if you weren't such a control freak, we wouldn't be in this mess." Tank rounded on him, his fists clenched. But the tension in the group was undeniable. Sam and Emily decided it was time to escalate their plan. They began leaving small, subtle clues that someone was watching the bikers. A few anonymous notes appeared in Tank's belongings, warning him to back off. One morning, Tank found his motorcycle moved just slightly out of place, a simple but unnerving act that left him visibly shaken. "He's starting to crack," Emily observed, watching from a distance as Tank barked orders at his crew. "They're not used to being on the defensive." Sam nodded. "That's the idea. A predator who feels hunted becomes unpredictable. And unpredictable people make mistakes." The final push came one rainy evening. Emily was leaving the hospital when Jake, the younger biker who had shown hesitation earlier, approached her again. "I need to talk to you," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Emily raised an eyebrow but gestured for him to follow her to a quieter spot. "What's on your mind?" she asked. Jake hesitated, then blurted out, "I don't want to be part of this anymore. Tank's losing it, and I'm not trying to go down with him." Emily studied him carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're not like him," Jake said. "You don't deserve what he's doing to you." Emily nodded slowly. "Then help me stop him." Jake looked torn, but after a moment, he nodded. "What do you need me to do?" With Jake's inside knowledge, Emily and Sam were able to map out the bikers' next moves. They learned that Tank was planning to confront Emily directly, hoping to scare her into leaving town. "Let him come," Sam said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll be ready." Jake's role was simple: keep the rest of the crew distracted while Emily and Sam dealt with Tank. The night of the confrontation, Emily stood in the parking lot of Pete's Diner, her stance steady and her expression unreadable. Tank's motorcycle roared as he approached, flanked by 2 of his men. "Brave of you to meet me here," Tank said, climbing off his bike. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she crossed her arms and waited. "You think you're tough?" Tank sneered. "You think you can mess with me?" "I think you're scared," Emily replied evenly. "And I think you've lost control." Tank's face twisted in rage, but before he could make a move, Sam stepped out of the shadows. "Let me guess," Sam said, his voice calm but menacing. "You're the big bad leader of this little gang." Tank turned, his bravado faltering as he took in the older man's confident stance. "Who the hell are you?" Tank demanded. Sam smiled faintly. "The man who's going to make sure you never bother my daughter or this town again." The night was unusually quiet, the distant hum of crickets filling the air as Emily locked up the clinic for the evening. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and headed toward her car, her footsteps light but purposeful. The roar of motorcycles broke the silence. Emily froze for a moment, her sharp instincts kicking in. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Evening, nurse," came Tank's voice, dripping with arrogance. Emily exhaled slowly and turned to face them. Tank, flanked by 3 of his men, dismounted his bike, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. The scar on his cheek glinted under the dim streetlights, and his grin was a mix of menace and amusement. "Leaving so soon," he sneered, closing the distance between them. The other bikers spread out, their laughter bouncing off the surrounding buildings. Emily stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "You've got a lot of nerve," Tank said, his voice dropping to a growl. "You think you're smarter than us? You think you can disrespect me and walk away?" Emily's lips twitched into a faint smirk. "I think you don't know what you're getting into." Tank laughed, his voice loud and mocking. "Oh, is that so? And what are you gonna do about it, nurse?" Before Emily could respond, a low, commanding voice rang out from the shadows. "She doesn't have to do anything." The bikers turned as one, their faces twisting in confusion. Sam Grayson stepped into the dim light, his figure calm and steady. Dressed in a plain jacket and jeans, he looked like any other older man except for the sharp, deadly focus in his eyes. Tank's grin faded slightly. "And who the hell are you?" Sam didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate. "I'm the guy who taught her how to deal with people like you." Tank's bravado wavered, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Taught her, huh? So, what? You're her daddy?" Sam tilted his head slightly. "That's right. And I've spent my life dealing with bigger threats than a bunch of wannabe tough guys on motorcycles." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, but Tank barked out a laugh. "You think you can scare us, old man?" Sam's expression didn't change. "No. But I know I can stop you." Tank's patience snapped. He lunged forward, swinging a fist toward Sam. But before the punch could connect, Sam sidestepped smoothly, grabbing Tank's arm and twisting it behind his back in one fluid motion. The leader let out a howl of pain, his knees buckling as Sam forced him down. The other bikers hesitated for a moment before rushing in. "Emily, now!" Sam barked. Emily didn't need to be told twice. One of the bikers, a stocky man with a shaved head, lunged at her, but she sidestepped gracefully, using his momentum against him. She grabbed his arm, twisting it just enough to send him sprawling to the ground. Another biker swung a chain at her, but Emily ducked low, sweeping his legs out from under him. The clatter of the chain hitting the ground echoed loudly, followed by his grunt of pain. Sam, meanwhile, had Tank pinned against the side of a car. "You think you're in charge here," he growled. "You've spent too long bullying people who won't fight back. But you picked the wrong family this time." Tank struggled, his face contorted with rage, but Sam's grip was unrelenting. The remaining biker, a wiry man with a wiry beard, hesitated as he watched his crew go down one by one. Emily turned to him, her expression calm but cold. "Do you really want to be next?" she asked. The man glanced at Tank, then back at Emily. With a muttered curse, he turned and bolted, his footsteps fading into the night. Tank's rage boiled over. "You think you're so tough, huh? This isn't over." Sam released him, letting him stumble back. "It's over when I say it's over." Before Tank could respond, Emily stepped forward, her voice steady. "You're going to leave this town. Tonight. And if I ever see you or your crew again, you'll regret it." Tank's defiance faltered. For the first time, he saw Emily not as a quiet nurse but as someone far more dangerous. "You've got no idea who you're messing with," he spat. Emily tilted her head, her gaze sharp. "Neither do you." Tank staggered to his feet, clutching his arm where Sam had twisted it. "You're just some nurse," he snarled, though the words lacked conviction. Emily stepped closer, her voice low and deadly. "I grew up with a father who taught me how to survive. How to fight. How to take down people like you. So, no, I'm not just a nurse. And you? You're not even close to the biggest threat I've faced." Sam crossed his arms, watching as the truth began to sink in for Tank and his men. "You think you're untouchable," Sam added. "But every bully meets someone who pushes back. Consider this your first and only warning. Tank's bravado crumbled completely. He motioned for his remaining crew to follow him, muttering under his breath as they climbed onto their bikes. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, leaving the parking lot eerily quiet. As the dust settled, Sam turned to Emily, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You handled yourself well. Emily shrugged, though her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Guess I had a good teacher. The diner door opened, and a few of the staff peered out, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. One of them, a waitress named Sarah, stepped forward hesitantly. Are you okay? She asked. Emily nodded. We're fine. They won't be bothering anyone anymore. Sarah looked at Sam, then back at Emily. You're not just a nurse, are you? Emily smiled faintly. No. But let's keep that between us. That night, as they sat in Emily's living room, Sam leaned back in his chair, a look of quiet pride on his face. You didn't need me as much as you thought. Emily chuckled. Maybe not. But it was nice to have backup. Sam raised his glass of water in a mock toast. To never underestimating the quiet ones. Emily smiled, the tension of the past weeks finally melting away. To never underestimating anyone. Outside, the night was peaceful once again. Willow Creek had its calm back, and Emily knew it would stay that way. For now. As the peaceful night embraced the small town of Willow Creek, Emily sat back in her chair, reflecting on the events that had just unfolded. It had been a long and grueling few weeks, but now the danger had passed, at least for now. The bikers, once a looming threat to her peaceful existence, had finally learned the hard way that there were consequences for pushing people too far. But Emily knew that even though she had made it through this challenge, life in Willow Creek had a way of turning unpredictable when you least expected it. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. There were always new threats, new people who would come to test her, and new battles to fight. Her father, Sam, sat across from her, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He was quiet, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. Though he had seen his fair share of action in his years working for the CIA, there was something different about the way he approached this situation. It wasn't about taking down a criminal organization or infiltrating a dangerous syndicate. It was about protecting his daughter, and that was a battle he took very seriously. I'm proud of you, Em, Sam finally spoke, his voice low but filled with genuine pride. You handled yourself well tonight. You've got more of your mother in you than I gave you credit for. Emily chuckled softly, grateful for her father's approval. I had a good teacher, she said, her eyes meeting his. But don't get used to it. I can't always depend on you to bail me out. Sam's grin widened, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of pride and amusement. I didn't expect you to, kid. But I'll always have your back when you need it. You just have to ask. Emily leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. She had proven herself in this small town, but her father's words echoed in her mind: there would always be new battles. And she wasn't sure she was ready for the next one yet, but she would be. She had to be. Do you think they'll come back? She asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Sam's expression grew serious as he thought for a moment. Maybe. But not as they were. Those bikers were a pack of trouble, but I think you made it clear they're no match for you. They'll have to rethink their priorities after what happened tonight. Emily nodded slowly, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. I don't know if I want to deal with more trouble. I just want things to go back to normal. Normal? Sam laughed softly. What's normal for you, kid? Your mother always said that normal was just a setting on the dryer. She smiled at the memory of her mother. She had passed away a few years earlier, but the lessons and strength she had instilled in Emily remained. Even in the face of danger, Emily had drawn on the strength her mother had taught her: never show fear, always stand your ground, and most importantly, never back down. Yeah, Emily said, shaking her head, normal is overrated anyway. The two of them sat in comfortable silence, the soft sound of the wind outside the only noise filling the room. The tension that had gripped Willow Creek for so long had finally begun to fade, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the peace she now felt was fragile. Life was never that simple. The next few days passed without incident. The bikers had left, and the small town of Willow Creek returned to its usual pace. People went about their daily lives, talking about the strange events at the diner with wide-eyed curiosity, but no one really knew the full story. As far as anyone was concerned, the bikers had simply vanished. Emily, however, couldn't help but feel like there was more to it than that. The tension was gone, but it didn't mean the threat had disappeared. Sam had made it clear that he'd been watching the bikers for a while before they started causing trouble in Willow Creek. He had a plan in place, and though Emily knew he'd always protect her, there was still that gnawing feeling of uncertainty inside her. She was used to being in control of situations, but this one had spiraled so quickly. It had forced her to confront parts of her past she hadn't expected. Parts of herself she thought she had buried. As she drove down the quiet streets, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. For the first time in her life, Emily had faced something that she couldn't control. Maybe I am just a nurse after all, she muttered to herself as she turned the corner near the hospital. It was the first time in a long while that she had allowed herself to question everything she thought she knew about herself. The next few weeks were uneventful, and with each passing day, Emily's confidence returned. But there was something else, a creeping awareness that the peace she was enjoying could be temporary. Sam was right, every bully eventually meets someone who pushes back. But that didn't mean they stayed down for long. Emily's thoughts were interrupted when a familiar face walked into the hospital one afternoon. It was Sarah, the waitress from Pete's Diner. She had been a quiet observer of the drama that had unfolded, but she had never fully understood the depth of Emily's involvement. "I've been thinking about what happened, and I just wanted to say thank you," Sarah said, standing by Emily's desk. Her expression was filled with admiration. "I know you handled things on your own, but I can't help but feel like something changed. Maybe you're not just the nurse from the diner anymore." Emily smiled faintly, glancing around the busy hospital. "I'm just doing my job, Sarah. Nothing more." "You're more than that," Sarah insisted. "I know you've got your reasons for not telling anyone, but you should know that we're all grateful. Not everyone could have stood up to those guys the way you did." Emily's smile grew, though it was tinged with sadness. "Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it." As the days passed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads. She had dealt with the bikers, but the experience had left her feeling unsettled. In a town as quiet as Willow Creek, things could go from calm to dangerous without warning. Emily had learned that the hard way. She wasn't naive. She had already started preparing for whatever might come next, another threat, a new danger, or something else entirely. The truth was, life was unpredictable. But she had survived the worst. And with the lessons her father had taught her, and the strength of her mother in her heart, Emily was ready to face whatever challenges came next. Sam had given her the tools she needed to protect herself. He had taught her how to deal with enemies, how to stay calm in the face of danger. And for that, Emily was eternally grateful. But there was something deeper in her now. She wasn't just the quiet nurse anymore. She was stronger, smarter. And when life threw its challenges her way, she would face them head on. No one would underestimate Emily Grayson again. The quiet hum of Willow Creek was broken by the sound of sirens echoing through the streets. In the parking lot outside Pete's Diner, the bikers lay subdued, their bodies sprawled out in awkward positions. Some groaned in pain, clutching at their bruised ribs and battered faces. The leader, the hulking man with the scar running down his cheek, was the worst of them all. His face twisted in agony as he tried to push himself up, only to collapse back to the ground with a grunt. Emily stood tall, her posture confident, but her eyes were cold. The fight was over, but she wasn't about to show mercy. The bikers had pushed her too far, and now they would face the consequences. Beside her, Sam Grayson surveyed the scene with his usual calm intensity. His posture was relaxed, but the tension in his muscles betrayed the years of experience he had accumulated in situations like this. He was a man who didn't need to show off his strength, it was already understood. "Good work, Em," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to be heard over the distant sounds of police cars approaching. Emily didn't respond at first. She looked down at her hands, which were still steady, despite the chaos that had just unfolded. After a few seconds, she finally spoke, her tone calm but tinged with a satisfaction that only came from taking control of her own fate. "I told you not to underestimate me," Emily said, brushing some dirt off her scrubs. She glanced down at the mess she had made of her otherwise neat attire but didn't seem to care. She had more important things on her mind now. The bikers had underestimated her, just as they had underestimated everyone they encountered. They assumed she was just another small-town nurse, a person to be pushed around, humiliated, and ignored. But Emily was more than they could ever imagine. She had spent years honing skills that most people in Willow Creek couldn't even comprehend. And tonight, those skills had come to fruition. As the police arrived and took charge of the scene, Emily watched the bikers being handcuffed and read their rights. There was a sense of quiet satisfaction in her, but also a small knot of worry. She knew this wasn't over. It never was. But for now, the danger had passed, and justice had been served. The news of what had happened in the diner's parking lot spread like wildfire. At first, it was just gossip. Whispers in the local coffee shop, hushed conversations on the front porches of suburban homes. But as the days passed, the story of Emily Grayson, the quiet nurse who had taken down a gang of dangerous bikers, began to take on a life of its own. The local newspaper ran an article detailing the events, though they left out many of the finer details. What the reporters couldn't capture was the sheer calmness with which Emily had faced the bikers. They couldn't describe the way she had moved, the way she had become a force of nature in the midst of chaos. Instead, they stuck to the basics: local nurse defends herself against dangerous gang. But Willow Creek didn't need the article to tell them the story. They had seen it firsthand. At the hospital, Emily found herself the subject of hushed conversations. Nurses, doctors, and even patients who had previously ignored her now gave her looks of respect and admiration. They saw her as more than just the kind woman who patched up cuts and bruises. She was now a quiet legend. "Did you hear what she did?" a nurse named Carla whispered to another nurse one afternoon in the break room. "I heard she took on 5 of those bikers. All by herself." Carla's voice dropped to a near whisper, as if she were sharing the most precious secret. Some of the others tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. She took them out, one by one. Emily, sitting just a few seats away, didn't react. She had never been one for attention, but she couldn't help but overhear the admiration in their voices. It felt good, in a way, but it also felt strange. She wasn't used to being seen as something more than just a nurse. But maybe this was a new beginning for her. As the days turned into weeks, the presence of the bikers became a thing of the past. With their arrest and the evidence gathered against them, the gang was quickly dismantled. The police discovered that the bikers had been involved in a string of robberies, assaults, and even worse crimes across several states. Their arrest made headlines, but it also marked the end of a long chapter for Willow Creek, a chapter where fear and uncertainty had ruled, even if only for a short while. Despite the bikers' capture, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering in the air. She had won this battle, but there was always the potential for new challenges to arise. People, after all, were never predictable. One evening, after a long shift at the hospital, Emily found herself walking back to her car when she noticed a familiar figure leaning against the trunk. It was Sam. He was still dressed in his usual dark jacket, his posture relaxed but purposeful. "You're out late," Emily said, her voice tired but light. "I know, I was waiting for you," Sam replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He pushed off the car and stood up straight. "I think it's time we talked." Emily raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Sam paused, his eyes scanning the quiet street, and then he turned to face her. "About the future. About what comes next." Emily took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about that too." Though Emily had proven herself, it wasn't just her physical strength or combat skills that made her formidable. It was her quiet determination, her ability to remain composed in the face of chaos, and her unyielding desire to protect the people she cared about. She had earned the respect of Willow Creek, but she had also learned something valuable, that no one could do it alone. She wasn't just the nurse anymore. She was someone who had faced darkness and emerged stronger. And while she wasn't sure what the future held, she was ready to face it head on. With Sam's support and the town's respect, Emily had made her place in Willow Creek. But she knew that challenges were inevitable. And when they came, she would be ready to defend herself, ready to protect the ones she loved, and ready to stand up against anyone who dared to threaten her peace. She turned to her father, her eyes steady and determined. "Whatever comes next, we'll handle it together." Sam smiled, his gaze softening with pride. "That's the spirit. Whatever happens, I know you're ready." And with that, Emily Grayson, the quiet nurse who had faced down an entire gang of bikers, walked into the future with a sense of strength and resolve. She had earned her place in Willow Creek, but more importantly, she had learned that justice wasn't just about fighting back. It was about standing tall, even when the world seemed stacked against you. And Emily Grayson stood taller than ever. As Emily stood in front of the glass doors of the hospital, the soft glow of the early morning sun casting a warm light across the parking lot, she couldn't help but pause for a moment. The day was just beginning, and she was already tired from the weight of the world pressing against her shoulders. But as she gazed at her reflection in the glass, she saw something different. Not just the tired eyes or the scrubs she wore every day. She saw strength, quiet, unassuming, but undeniably strong. Her father's words echoed in her mind, clear and unwavering: "You don't need to raise your voice to make a point. Strength speaks for itself." Emily exhaled slowly, taking in the familiar sight of the hospital's entrance. It was a place she had worked for years, healing the broken and caring for the sick. It was a place where she had earned her place through hard work and quiet dedication. But lately, it had become more than just a job. It had become the symbol of everything she had fought for and everything she was steadfast, resilient, and, despite everything, still standing tall. In the past, she might have second-guessed herself. She might have wondered if people really respected her, or if they saw her as just another face in the crowd, just another nurse doing her job. But now, she understood something that had eluded her before. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who don't flaunt it. They don't need to make a spectacle of their power or draw attention to themselves. They simply are. The quietest people in the room can be the ones who move mountains without saying a word. They don't need to shout, to make a grand show of their strength. Their actions speak louder than any words ever could. And as Emily stood there, she realized that the storm she had weathered, those bikers, the threats, the challenges, had all been part of her journey. It wasn't just about the battle itself. It was about how she had handled it, how she had faced each moment with calm, controlled strength. She hadn't let her anger take over. She had stayed focused, clear-headed, and driven by a purpose far greater than any temporary challenge. The bikers had made a mistake. They had thought that kindness was a sign of weakness. They had assumed that because she was quiet, because she didn't stand out, they could push her around. They hadn't realized that her silence wasn't a lack of strength. It was the calm before the storm. And they hadn't seen the storm coming. Emily smiled softly to herself, the faintest hint of satisfaction in her expression. She knew what she was capable of now. Not just in the fight, but in life. And she knew that sometimes, the real battle wasn't the one in front of you. It was the one inside you. It was the fight to stay true to who you are, to your values, your strength, and your quiet resilience. There would be more challenges ahead, of that she was sure. The world was full of people who underestimated others, who took kindness for weakness. But Emily was ready. She had learned that standing strong wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, it was about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. It was about knowing your worth and not letting anyone else define it for you. As she pushed open the doors of the hospital and stepped inside, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just the nurse anymore. She wasn't just the quiet woman with the gentle smile. She was more. And she would continue to be more, with every step she took. She was a force of nature. Quiet, but powerful. And nothing would ever change that. In the days that followed, Emily noticed the way people looked at her. They didn't look at her with fear, not exactly. But there was a certain respect in their eyes. A recognition that she was someone not to be underestimated. And though Emily didn't seek the spotlight, she didn't mind it either. She had earned that respect through actions, not words. She continued her work at the hospital, treating patients with the same kindness she always had, but now there was a deeper understanding in her. She knew that her strength wasn't just about what she could do in a fight. It was about how she showed up every day strong, steady, and unshakable. How she held her ground, no matter what came her way. And how, no matter the challenge, she would always stand tall. As the weeks went by, Emily's life began to settle into a rhythm again. The biker's presence in Willow Creek was nothing more than a distant memory, but the lessons from that night remained with her. She knew now that strength wasn't something you flaunted. It wasn't about being the loudest or the most aggressive. It was about staying true to who you were, no matter the noise around you. It was about having the courage to stand up for what was right, even when others doubted you. And, most importantly, it was about being confident enough in yourself to never have to prove anything to anyone. The sun rose each day, casting its light over the hospital, and each day Emily walked in with the same quiet strength she had always had. But now, she knew what that strength meant. She understood that true power didn't come from brute force or loud declarations. It came from knowing yourself, knowing that, no matter what the world threw at you, you could face it with courage, grace, and quiet determination. There would always be those who underestimated her. There would always be people who assumed that kindness was weakness. But Emily had learned something important. She had learned that the quietest person in the room often holds the most power. And those who judge based on appearances, they're the ones who never see it coming. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a force. And no one, not even the loudest and most intimidating, could take that away from her. And as Emily went about her day, greeting patients, offering gentle advice, and doing her best to heal the sick and broken, she carried with her an unshakable truth. Strength speaks for itself. You don't need to raise your voice to make a point. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You just need to be yourself, quiet, steady, and unshakable. And in the end, that's what would make all the difference.